Welcome back to the Ready State. What I want to talk about today is a very common phenomenon in the gym, is that an athlete gets injured in sports. And remember how we define injury as cannot occupy my role in society, can't occupy my role in the team, can't do my job, or there's a bone sticking out of my leg. I have clear disruption of some sort of tissues. And once I've been shepherded through the medical process, cleared to sort of return to training, return to sport, we see that there's a big gap. And we call this gap the transitional athlete. Well, one of the things that we know is that the transitional athlete is sort of left to fend for his or herself. And a lot of coaches are like, well, we'll just kind of start, or we'll just won't pay attention to it for a while. And a lot of times, let me give you a personal example, is my daughter Georgia, who had a really terrible spiral fracture a couple years ago, came out of her cast after 12 weeks or 13 weeks in the cast, and they were like, okay, she's all ready to go. And I was like, she's all ready to go? She's been in a cast for 13 weeks. Like, you don't have a plan for this? And remember that once we've dealt with pathology, not the role anymore, it's the role for, hopefully, of the physio coach. And we know that there are not enough physio coaches in the world, so it's got to be the role of the coach. So I want to give you guys some basic templates and some basic ideas around how we approach athletes like this in a systematic manner. So first and foremost, one of the things we try to do while an athlete is healing, maybe in injury rehab, maybe under the care of a physical therapist, maybe in a tissue healing time, is that we still try to keep them metabolically fit. And that means that we simplify the system and we get an assault bike. And we call that the assault bike beatdown. And if we're not doing a good job of keeping our athletes plugged in metabolically, plugged in conditioning on a conditioning standpoint, then what we see is that we actually lose a lot of opportunity and a lot of ground. So not only are we going to see circulation, not only do we have the opportunity to keep the athlete engaged in class, kind of doing their pieces, but we see that that's an easy way to begin to sort of think about loading and breathing and challenging and even desensitizing the tissues. So metabolically aside, one of the things that we can start by saying is, well, what is normal range of motion? How do we restore normative range of motion? And that means specifically is the restoration of full capacity or full archetypes. So what's going to happen is that someone's going to hit their tissue healing markers, someone's going to potentially end up being pain-free, and they're going to be discharged. And that means that they are not at full capacity, they do not have skills, they do not have tissue tolerance, and they may not even have full range of motion. And because the medical system doesn't rely or get paid or compensated for people to be able to restore their full range of motion as part of the normal rehab process, it's got to fall on us. And so a lot of times what happens is that athletes come out and they're discharged, and we're like, okay, you're done being cared for, can you put your arms over your head? And there's clearly something still amiss. So one of the plans is to say, hey, do you have full range of motion in the injured joint, injured tissue system? And that means that we can begin to work on that. And for us, it's about the archetype, which really ends up being the bookmark or the bookend of physiologic function. So, you can go back into the physical therapy books, you can go back into Norkin and White, you can look at American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons and see for yourself what normative range of motion is and chase that, or you can use the language of strength and conditioning, which is the language we prefer. So if someone's coming through with a knee injury, one of the first things we're going to begin to do is squat, for example. So let's talk about this repair or sort of loading as we kind of get back to return to function. So one of the ways that we'll do that is by making sure that our athletes begin with body weight motions and breathing, and we'll work on isometric control at those end ranges. So what does it look like to squat in a pain-free range to a depth that we can control without compensation, and holding that breath and holding that position with a 3 to 5 second breath. So taking 3 breaths, taking 5 breaths, using breathing and tying that to these isometrics at these end ranges is an easy way to begin the on-ramp program if they're there. If we can already have normative pain-free range of motion and we can start to load that isometric, then we start to shift into a really simple pattern, which is, hey, let's stay in pain-free ranges while we chase additional range. And what we do is we work on a simple 5x5 basic linear progression model. And this should be very, very comfortable with you based on dumbbells, high degrees of stability, based on tempo, moving in our basic patterns but slowing down. So we've always said that, hey, we really only have 2 real ways that we can challenge your position when you're injured. And you're going to see that things either fall into the categories of, hey, I am stopping, doing an isometric, or I'm slowing down. So remember that those two things really end up making our template as this return to sport. So if someone's got pain or is coming back, you notice that the first thing we said was, hey, can you hold your arm up over your head in a variety of positions and shapes? Can you breathe in those positions? Telling the brain that we're gonna have to own these end range shapes. So end range isometric body weight control, step one. Step two then is, hey, we're gonna start squatting. And we may be even squatting as we're rehabbing backs and rehabbing knees, rehabbing hips. What we do is we'll slow way down. So a 3 to 5 second descent with maybe a pause in the bottom, just to make sure that we can tie in the isometric. And then we let the athlete go up as fast as they want. And as the athlete starts to return back to normal function, you'll see that their speed coming out of the hole, returning in the concentric phase, will always be dictated by them. And one of our favorite old kind of tropes is that, speed is really the sport of position. It's really the ultimate thing that we're going to challenge in the long haul. And return to sport ready is that you need to be able to move your body under kind of speed conditions. So what we have is, first of all, do I have pain-free ranges, or can I stay in some pain-free ranges? So if this is full overhead, I might be able to begin pressing on a landmine with higher stability, not in a full capacity, but I'm going to still be working towards that as part of my rehab training transitional athlete process. So we've got this basic 5x5, 5 sets of 5 with tempo, slowing down, pause, letting the athlete go back up. And what we then do is systematically begin to load that. So it may be that they're holding a 5-pound plate, and the next week they're holding 5 pound, next time is 5 pounds and 6 pounds, or we're adding 1 kilo or 2 per. And when we have an athlete who's rehabbing and reloading a tissue, we're trying to get really basic progression out of that tissue, and we might load it 3 to 5 times a week. So if you're squatting, you're out of a knee problem, you can count on squatting 3 to 5 times a week with us, no matter what, as sort of your base training. Why? Because we want to get lots and lots of repetitions in. So by the time we progress to a bar, it's a bar plus 2.5s. And the next time you do this in the week, it's bar plus 5s, and bars plus 5s and 2.5s. And what we're going to really do is just take really small incremental load. What we find is that the physiology is there to actually support that quick gain, and that this basic linear progression model is the fastest way we know to take the slack out of the system, to get the athlete loading, to get the athlete the tissues time to protect themselves, to rebuild, and more importantly, desensitize and reintegrate. So what we'll do is we'll wave up to a heavy 5x5 when an athlete begins missing that 5x5, that basic linear progression. We'll just wave them down again. And if this sounds familiar, it's because the 5x5 concept, this basic linear progression model, is the way that we treat and train a lot of our beginner athletes. And that this is a simple way that our athletes understand this 5x5 concept with basic linear progression models. And then they're like, oh, I know what I'm doing already. So suddenly they're independent, can be modulating their load, trying to hit those 5 sets of 5, keeping the tempo, 3 to 5 second descent with a pause, controlling the upset. The second we start to get under roll there, we'll then add in a little bit of cardiorespiratory demand in between. So as we get our athletes through, we'll initially separate strength motor control from some cardiorespiratory conditioning, again, basic assault biking. But the second we've had an athlete kind of get some progress on, we'll start to complicate their system by maybe dropping down to sets of 3 or 3 sets of 5, waving down, and then we'll drop in some heavy metabolic load in between so that we can start to challenge that position, not just with load, but with a little bit of cardiorespiratory demand. So you'll see our athletes will do a minute sprint or a 2-minute sprint, and then come back in and do their basic linear progression models, which could be, 3s, 10 sets of 3, 5 sets of 5, whatever it works. Adding in that challenge of some cardiometabolic demand, cardiorespiratory metabolic demand, on top of those basic linear progressions is a model to really progress the basics. And what we find then is that when we're looking at lunge shapes, looking at squat shapes, looking at hinge shapes, looking at the shape that we're trying to restore, what you realize is that you already possess the language. All of the formal language of strength conditioning is a corrective exercise. All the formal language of range of motion is already conjoined with the movement tools of being able to do a push-up, being able to strict press and hang from a bar. The key here is that you can always take load out. So if I'm trying to reestablish hanging concepts for my athletes, which would be an end range isometric, we might have them use a band to unload their body weight, and then work on breathing, staying in pain-free ranges to modulate that, right? So you already possess the language that you need to move this transitional athlete through, and it doesn't have to be mysterious, because start position and finish position is the magic, and more importantly, you already possess the language of isometrics and tempo. Start by that 5x5, keep your athletes metabolically fit, and you'll find that you already possess a very, very powerful language of movement once athletes have been cleared and returned hot to come back to your gym. Hope that helps.